Alrighty, well, in this episode of Faith in Focus, we're going to continue on in the book of James. I hope you've been enjoying listening to these teachings. And once again, I would encourage you, if you have thoughts, questions about the text, you want to add to the conversation, feel free to email me, reach out to me on social media. All those links are in the show notes for this podcast. So I would encourage you to do that. But just as a recap, we've looked at James, who was a pastor to Jewish Christians. This is really early on in the church age. Probably, I would argue, within just a few years of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. The Jewish people in Jerusalem have scattered after the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 8. And so they're now flung out into the world, basically. They are like refugees, expelled from their homes. And they're suffering. Well, first of all, that would be a pretty terrible thing to go through, to be expelled from your home, and now you're living amongst a foreign nation. But it would have been extra painful for these Jewish people because they're used to being a close-knit religious community with other like-minded people. They had their own laws, they had their own diets, they had their own dress, customs, and now they're flung out into the Gentile world where nobody respects these laws, nobody follows these rules, nobody follows the commandments or dietary laws, none of that. So you're cut off from all of that stuff, and you're amidst what they would view as icky, dirty sinners. And so there was a religious component to it, there was a spiritual component to it, just being very uncomfortable. I mean, just think of an analogy we might be able to compare. Would be like, think of your, sweet old grandma who grew up in the church and, has never said a bad word in her life and has never drank alcohol, has never stepped foot in a bar, just very stereotypical, sweet little old conservative woman. And then she gets thrown out of her home and now she's living in like Las Vegas or something. And that's where she has to live, is like on the strip or Fremont Street in Las Vegas. I mean, it would just be culture shock and be radical. So that would be tough. And then, so what Jews would typically do is try to congregate, in communities within, if they found themselves in a city out in the Roman Empire, and they would kind of form their synagogue so they could continue on their customs. But being a follower of Jesus as the Messiah, you were ostracized even from that community. So these people are really suffering, and we saw that James was giving exhortations to them on how to understand suffering, how to process suffering, how to endure it well, how to realize what, maybe not the purpose of suffering, but a purpose that can come out of suffering, and growth and maturity that can sustain you in life. And those things are going to be very important because as James goes on, he's going to start encouraging them throughout this book, and we'll see in this section, to live a very mature life. And it's tough to live a mature and upright life when you're struggling. When you're facing hardships, the last thing you want to do is live a Christ-like life, because it's like, I'm in like survival mode. I'm just trying to not lose it myself. And so the natural tendency is to turn inward and to self-protect. And so all of these, negative behaviors and thought patterns, you become defensive, you become critical of other people, like just the walls go up, and it's not good. And what we are being called on as Christians is to reach out to other people and to recognize that, when we talk about suffering, we are sharing in the fellowship of Christ's sufferings, to view it also as, hey, this is something that Christ went through, and if I want to be like Christ, this is something that Christ did. He suffered, and in the midst of suffering, he still ministered to others. He still, think about washing the feet of the disciples. He knew he was at the point of death. He knew his friends were about to betray him, and yet he took on the form of a servant and got down and washed their feet. Think about the feeding of the 5,000. If you remember the context of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus had just lost John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist was probably meaningful to some of the disciples too, like Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist, so he would have been close to him too, but this was Jesus' cousin. Was probably close to him and was, had a religious kinship not only just biological, but was probably close with John the Baptist. He just gets executed, and I don't know. We can't speculate on Jesus' inner working and what his thought process was about that, but it had to have been tough, not only just emotionally, but knowing that you're the Messiah, that you're God, that you had the power to just storm in there and destroy all these Romans and free your cousin, free your friend, and the Father did not give the go-ahead. Jesus only did what the Father told him to do. And obviously the Father did not give him this go-ahead, and John the Baptist died. So that, there's just a lot of grief that he had to have been facing. So he goes to a solitary countryside to probably be alone with his disciples, spend some time alone with the Father, and then all of a sudden thousands of people show up and they're like, hey, we're hungry. Give us something to eat. And so what he does is he rolls up his sleeves and gets out there and gets to work and is ministering. And so that's the attitude of Christ, and that's what James is wanting to push us towards, is recognizing that, hey, suffering is going to come, but with an attitude of endurance and perseverance, and obviously looking to our position in Christ and looking to who we are in Christ. We can grow in maturity through suffering, and probably grow more in suffering than we would in just like a peacetime where things are much more relaxed. So there's opportunity for growth, and that growth is what's going to then lead us on to true Christianity, true living for the Lord and ministering for the Lord. And so we ended right at the very tail end of chapter 1. And in verse 26, he says, if someone thinks he is religious, yet does not bridle his tongue, and so deceives his heart, his religion is futile. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their misfortune, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So it's awfully tempting to view the most religious people in the room as those who know all the answers, who can say the right words, who know all the talking points. They can rattle off theology and Bible verse this and Bible verse that. And sometimes I think we do that as a way, like that's maybe when we see suffering, we try to intellectualize it. We try to spiritualize it. And what is the cause of suffering, and why would God allow this? And is God sovereign? If God's sovereign, how does that work? Does he in control? Did he cause it? All of these different things. We might have all these different answers, and we can talk. And what James is trying to say is, what a person needs is not talk. I mean, that's not the only thing that they need. If you're only talking and you're not doing something, that is not pure religion in God's eyes. And of course, if you know anything about the book of James, you're probably hearing that already and thinking that sounds familiar. And it does. It's almost like James is sort of setting the stage as he intros into a very infamous passage in chapter 2, which we'll get to in a few episodes. What he's really saying is, doing something is what helps people. Telling them, God loves you, or, hey, God ordained this trial just for you so you can grow. It's like, well, okay, thanks. That doesn't help the person. So when you've got orphans and widows, obviously orphans and widows, what does that imply? Their parents are dead, their spouse is dead. Like that, suffering, they're hurting. Pure and undefiled religion is to care for them in their misfortune, not to tell them about why their misfortune happened or what they can do to get out of their misfortune. Now, those things might be helpful, but that's not the only thing that they need. What they need is just help. And now that might not necessarily be financial help. That might be just a listening ear. That may be friendship. That might, it's not just handouts and money. Yet, what they need is somebody to help them, to actually tangibly help them. So this bridling of the tongue is controlling the tongue. Again, it would be wrong for us to say that this means don't ever use your tongue. This idea that words are not helpful. No, words are helpful, but bridling the tongue means you are in control of what you're saying. You're not just spouting off, silly platitudes. These are things that you learn like if you go through courses on grief counseling, there are just things that we say when someone's grieving that are usually not super helpful. But we say them because we don't know what else to say. Things like, "Hey, I know what you're going through." Well, it sounds good. It's our way of trying to empathize, but really, unless you're really in that person's shoes, you don't really know the situation. You might be able to have an idea of what they're going through, but that's not necessarily helpful to say, "I know what you're going through," or just to say, "Hey, God loves you," or "Hey, they're in a better place if someone's died." Those things might be true, but bridling your tongue is controlling them and knowing maybe the right time to have those conversations. That might not be what they need to hear at that moment. And so he's already introducing this concept of a futile or worthless religion. And again, that's going to play a role throughout the book of James. Now, let's tie this again to what we've seen already in chapter 1. He's talked about this the telos. That's this Greek word for like mature. When something is fulfilling its purpose and it's doing the thing that it is supposed to be doing, we would say, it is mature. It's telos has been realized, or whatever. Well, the opposite of that, we talked about a table. If a table's telos is to, be sturdy, to stand on, its legs, not wobble, and to hold things from falling off onto the ground. That's what its purpose is. So we say it's a good table. Well, a worthless table would be one that does not do that. It's not achieving its telos. So if we think about what does God want us to do on this earth? What is our purpose? What is our meaning? What is our religion? What does our religion call us to do? That implies that there's a telos. There's a purpose to it. When we look at it and say, "Well, that's a good religion right there. It's doing what it's supposed to do." And so obviously in Christianity, James doesn't necessarily dive into all of this stuff, but within Christianity, it would obviously be including preaching the gospel, winning people to Christ, showing people who Christ is, and maturing in Christ, discipleship, all that kind of stuff. But a religion that's worthless is not doing those things. So if you're just talking and you're not actually putting action to your words, well, that's worthless. And of course, he says keeping yourself unstained by the world. So he's not negating that. He recognizes that, hey, that's a very real possibility that you're out there in a world that is very sinful and it's very carnal. You're not in like a little conservative Jewish bubble anymore. You are now out in the midst of the Roman Empire. So yes, pure and undefiled religion. Don't turn inward. You need to keep that outward focus, caring for other people, but also keeping yourself unstained by the world. And this is something that is very difficult to do. The world is everywhere. The world system is everywhere. And Satan is the god of this world, and he can use the world system to move people away from God. That's why it's very helpful to understand that is Satan's goal and his objective, is to get you to walk away from God, to not have a relationship with God. Obviously, his desire would be that you never come to know God in the first place, but if that happens, he at least wants to handicap you, cripple you, make your life miserable so that maybe you stop walking with God or you're not a witness for God. That's what his desire is. So then when we realize we're in the world is controlled by Satan, he's using everything in his power and everything in the world to try to derail us, then you start to realize, okay, I'm in enemy territory. And then this idea of walking circumspectly and walking wisely and like recognizing that there's a lion out there prowling around. The way that you might walk around your little small town in America where everything's safe is very different than you might be walking around, in the jungles or on the Sahara Desert where there's like lions. You see these herds of lions prowling around you. You're going to be a lot more circumspect. Your eyes are going to be open. You're going to be paying a lot more attention. And I think one of the things that we do is we just slip into a complacency and we allow ourselves to become stained by the world. The world's way of thinking seep into our mind. A group of us were just talking about this the other day that, we were watching a video, and it was like showing people that live in the Hamptons and the huge mansions. And we were like, that's why people tend to not think that they are rich, the average person in America. Because they look at that and they think that is what wealthy people are like. I'm not rich because I certainly can't live that way. And it's like, well, you're still pretty rich by the world standards. If you're driving around in a car, got 2 pairs of shoes on your feet, and you know where your next meal's coming from, you're rich by all available metrics. And certainly by the standards of what people in the New Testament would classify as rich. And that was kind of one of the things we said was, you kind of have to understand rich as how James would have understood it. And there was 2 classes of people in James's day. The people who had to pray, Lord, give us this day our daily bread, because they didn't know where their next meal was coming from. And they were very acutely aware of that. Or there was people who didn't have to pray that prayer because they knew exactly where their next meal was coming from. My servants are going to get it for me. It comes from my cabinet in the kitchen, maybe. Whatever it may be, I know exactly where my next meal is coming from. And that's kind of where we are in America. Very rarely are there people dying of hunger in America. And if they are, there's typically some underlying reasons why. There's plenty of food available. Might not be food you like, but you've got food available. And so we're rich, according to James's standards, and we should keep that in mind. So let's travel right over into chapter 2. And he starts to admonish them about their way of conducting their services. They're probably would be similar to synagogue type things because that's all they knew. But maybe they were meeting in homes because they certainly probably didn't have access to buildings. Who were they going to get buildings from? They didn't have money to buy buildings. Probably weren't using pagan temples. Can't imagine them doing that. Synagogues wouldn't let them use it, so they probably were meeting in homes or any buildings that they were able to meet at. Paul comes across a group of people praying by the riverside in Philippi, so wherever they could meet, they would be getting together and basically doing church and having their gatherings. And so he says, "My brothers and sisters, do not show prejudice if you possess faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ. If someone comes into your assembly wearing a gold ring and fine clothing, and a poor person enters in filthy clothes, do you pay attention to the one who's finely dressed and say, 'You sit here in a good place,' and to the poor person, 'You stand over there or sit on the floor'? If so, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives?" So this exhortation that he's giving them about judging people, having this prejudice against poor people, essentially, he's hitting on a very human condition. It's something that we tend to do as people quite a lot. So this showing partiality, I really like on Blue Letter Bible when it defines partiality. Kind of has a longer definition. Usually their definitions aren't quite this long, but I thought this was great at explaining the concept. It says, "The fault of one who, when called on to give a judgment, has respect of the outward circumstances of man and not to their intrinsic merits, and so prefers, as the more worthy, one who is rich, highborn, or powerful, to another who does not have these qualities." And isn't that such a human tendency that we feel like fame or prestige or wealth or clout, just being near people, that will somehow rub off on you? And we fall into that, like, you can see that, like, people, you want, like, there's this weird human thing to cozy up to celebrity or people who have high status, or government officials. You want to be near them, and what we're doing is we're conferring on them certain merit or certain value just based on their externals. We think, well, I see this person on TV all the time. I see them giving interviews and everyone's laughing at what they're saying and everyone respects and wants to hear what they have to say. And wow, they're dressed really nice, or they're very wealthy. And man, if you're wealthy, you must have a good head on your shoulders. You know how to run a business. You know how to, parlay your talents and gifts into money. Just you must have so much, worth. Not just talking about financial worth, but worth as a person. And so we want to cozy up to that person because I want to know who you know. And of course, if you're poor, like James's audience likely was, I mean, the vast majority of them probably were poor. There's that tendency to want to rub shoulders with the rich, and maybe they're thinking, hey, we want this person to stick around because boy, we could sure use some of that money. Because again, remember, that's how the synagogue operated. Living in the synagogue was kind of like a communal type setting. You were able to get community aid and help, but as anyone knows who pays attention to governments and societies, like you have that kind of communal setting where everyone's putting in money, and then there's a huge social safety net to help people. That works fine if there's a lot of money being put into the pot. But if there's no wealthy people and that money dries up, there's no more social safety net. There's no more help giving out. So you can imagine this tendency on James's audience's part to, want to cozy up to wealthy people because, boy, we need a new infusion of cash into this group so we can, pay our bills or provide food and get food and all that kind of stuff. So this tendency then is to treat them with a certain level of dignity and respect. If you've been a listener of Faith and Focus for a while, I would encourage you to become a supporter of the ministry by becoming a monthly donor. Your generous donations allow me to continue working with InFaith and recording new content. You can find a link to my donation page in the show notes for this episode. Thank you. I mean, just imagine you've got somebody who comes in and they're really, decked out and in really nice clothes, and then someone else comes in filthy clothes. And, again, might not be the setting, but maybe you can imagine. Think of like modern day church where you've got somebody who comes in and they are, wearing a suit. They rolled up in a Cadillac. They come in and they're really dressed. Maybe not suits. Maybe you might think suits are a little cheesy in our modern non-denominational churches, but maybe they come in, with designer purses. They've got, the newest iPhone and iWatch and Apple Watch and technology, this and that, and they've got these design, they just look sharp. They're perfectly manicured hair. Their family's just perfectly, it's like a postcard looking family comes in and they driving these nice new cars, and we're just like, oh, I really want to cozy up to this person. And then someone else comes rolling in, and they're driving like a beater truck, and it's just barely, choking out, fumes out of the exhaust, and they come in and they're wearing like overalls, torn clothes, and maybe they just got off work working third shift or something like that, and they're coming in, and it's like James is saying, why would you show favoritism to the clean cut family and tell the other people to just, you sit on the floor over there, or you can go sit behind that, go sit behind the sound system or something. You can't see too well, but you'll have a good, you'll be able to hear pretty well, but just go sit over there. And we don't want to have anything to do with that person. And you don't know anything about them. You're completely judging based on the externals. And James talks about you've become judges with evil motives. So he's actually attributing, like, there's something sinister about why you're doing that. And you're doing it probably for selfishness, for selfish motives. And so that is a wrong attitude that we could have maybe when we're suffering, and like James's audience is. And I want people who can help alleviate my suffering and can help be a part of my community to make life better and make life more enjoyable, because community matters. Having a community is a good thing. And when you're suffering, you really want that, and it's helpful. And so I think if we're suffering and we're struggling and we're out looking for, who is God calling to be a part of this community of like-minded believers, And then if we look towards worldly things, worldly wealth and prestige, and we think that's who we need in our group, it's like, why? What standard are you using to make that judgment? Maybe the person who is dressed in shabby clothes, and maybe that's the exact person you need. Maybe that person is super spiritual, and they have like a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and maturity to share, but you just never give them the time of day. Now, it's true, maybe neither one of them are very good people, but the point is you don't know that, and you've made this judgment call. And in fact, as James will go on, like he'll talk about, you're actually probably playing yourself by judging the wealthy people as, oh, those are, super spiritual people. Let's treat these people really well, because he's going to go on to say these are the people who are actually persecuting you, the wealthy people. So, and again, it's human nature to do this, but I think what James is trying to call us to is, yes, that's natural, it's human nature, but this is not how we should be operating as Christians. We need to be different than that, and that takes a mature form of thinking. This is obviously something that comes through maybe getting burned by doing this. You learn over time, man, I did this in the past, and it was not good. You definitely should not be judging people by their outward situations. So he says, listen, this is verse 5. Listen, my brothers and sisters, did not God choose the poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom that he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor, and are not the rich oppressing you and dragging you into the courts? Do they not blaspheme the good name of the one you belong to? So this is kind of, James says, he doesn't even recognize it as sensible from a human standpoint. It really is. He's not saying that every rich person is the ones who are persecuting you, but he's probably reflecting on the fact that, like, listen to common sense and look at the situation you just came from. Who was it that executed Jesus? Who was it that persecuted the apostles? Who was it that stoned Stephen to death? It was the wealthy people. It was the elites. It was the ruling class. Why on earth would you think that just because somebody's a part of the ruling class, that they are somebody that you should cozy up to? Those are the people who are persecuting you. It just makes absolutely no sense, even from a human standpoint. And so he's kind of doing a two-pronged attack. He's saying, like, hey, listen, God has given a certain privilege to the poor. Now, again, this is not to say only that poor people, God only loves poor people, or only poor people can be saved. But there is this element of, when Jesus talks about the rich man, it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven because they don't feel like they have any need for it. So it's like God is kind of privileged just by the nature of the laws of nature. When people are poor, they need any help they can get, and they're ready to turn to the Lord, or they're more prone to turn to help outside of themselves. Rich people, I don't need really any help. I've got all my stuff taken care of. So on the one hand, hey, this poor person coming into your assembly, there's a good chance they're in the same boat as you, and that they know that they need God. The rich person, there's a good chance they will persecute you, because it was even more so back then. But there's truth to it now. If you're becoming rich in this world system and part of that ruling class, you almost kind of wonder, like, who did you have to bribe, or who did you have to flatter, or what part of your soul did you have to sell to get to the position that you're in now? And if that's the kind of, if a person is willing to compromise so much on their values and sell off their soul to get to a position of being wealthy, probably not somebody who maybe is somebody you want to cozy up to. And I think, just in closing, we'll wrap up on these verses, but I really think it's incredibly applicable to us. It's just kind of a corollary, like a parallel application that we need to be very careful about affirming people and ideas that the world also affirms. And like here's what I mean, and here's how I'm relating it to what James is saying. So if a person's wealthy and they're wearing gold rings and coming in with fine clothing, again in James's day, it's kind of like, that's the class of people who are persecuting us. Maybe you should wonder whether or not this person is a part of that ruling class, or who they know in that ruling class. Maybe they are maybe this is not somebody who God would have you be very close with. In the same way, you kind of have to wonder when you hear some ideologies espoused by people maybe come into the church with these ideas of how to really move the church forward, and what we have to do to advance the cause of Christianity, and what we need to do to bring the church into the 21st century, whatever it might be. And then you look at their philosophy and the way they conduct themselves, and it looks exactly like the world. That ought to give you pause. It might think, okay, hold on, wait a second. Why does this look so similar to the people who would persecute us and throw us in jail? Why is your ideology the same as the ideology of our ruling class, who would, stamp out Christianity if they had their druthers? So it's worth giving a pause and thinking about those things. I really think that the church has adopted ideologies and practices because they are fashionable. Now I understand I'm making kind of a play on words with like a rich person who's fashionable and ideas that are fashionable, but when we look at the church and realize that it functions almost exactly like a business, major mega churches, a lot of them even talk about themselves like they're businesses. They're not churches, they're organizations. It's not ministry, it's your role or your task or whatever, and you don't have pastors, we call them managers. They're managing the church and the organization. And so all of the marketing, the advertising, the preaching, it's all a show. And the idea is like, if you're going to be a pastor, you don't go to school to learn the Bible. You go to business school to learn how to do business. And so we want people who know how to run businesses, and we want people who know how to... And I just look at that and I think, why would we think that people who are successful in the world system, so James's point is a wealthy person, he's obviously successful by the world standards, comes into your assembly, why would you automatically give him preference just because he's worldly? So a person who's very successful by the world standards, they can speak well, they're eloquent, they know how to captivate an audience, they dress nice, they look presentable, whatever it might be. Those are standards by which the world measures success. We want those kinds of people running our businesses and growing our businesses. Why would we necessarily think that qualifies them to run or lead parts of God's church? And why would we preference those people and overlook the people who maybe are more quiet? They're maybe not all put together. They're not as polished. Maybe they can't articulate what they, by the world standards, maybe they're not a winner, quote unquote. And I'm using that, very tongue-in-cheek. They're not a winner by the world standards. Well, maybe that's exactly who God would want us to pay attention to and to show preference to, because maybe God's working in and through that person, and we don't want to overlook them. So we'll wrap it up there. We will continue on in chapter 2 on the next episode, and then we'll probably spend an episode or two in this controversial section in the end of James chapter 2. So I hope you enjoyed this episode and you have a great day.
While Faith in Focus is a ministry of InFaith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of InFaith as a mission.